Back in the essential training title, we looked at how to anchor an object into a particular place in a text story so that if the text moves, the object does too. In this movie, we're going to go deeper into anchored objects and decipher InDesign's incredibly confusing anchored objects dialog box. I have my JavaCo magazine document open here from the exercise files folder, and I'm going to jump to page 53. I'll press Command-J on the Mac or Control-J on Windows, type 53, and then click Enter or Return, and that takes me to page 53. I see this little object sitting off in the margin here. Let's zoom in on that. I'll double-click on the text to switch to the Type tool, and press Command-2 on the Mac or Control-2 on Windows, and then Option-Spacebar to get my grabber hand. That's Alt-Spacebar on Windows. And I can see that this object is just sitting out here in the margin. I can move it anywhere I want. It's not anchored anywhere into the text. To anchor that, as we learned in the Essential Training title, I go to the Edit menu and I say Cut, and then I'll double-click where I want to place it so that it switches to the Type tool, and then I paste. And that anchors that object into that position in the line. If the text changes, let's say I come up here and I start typing, you can see that the object moves with it. Let me undo that with Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows. Now, we're going to look at the options for this object. So I'll select the anchored object with a selection tool. I'll go to the Object menu, scroll down to Anchored Object, and choose Options. Let's move this dialog box out of the way so we can see it better. And we can see that by default, this is an inline object. Inline objects mean I can only move them up or down about a line, not very far, only about a line up or down in this paragraph. Can't move them left or right. They'll just stay in line wherever they happen to be anchored. I could also change this to an above line object. And an above line object is an object that sits between the line in which it's anchored and the line above it. And InDesign ignores leading, ignores space before, all of that, and it always makes space for that object, no matter how big it is. And we can actually do more things with an above line object. For example, we could set the alignment to center, and then perhaps give this a little bit more space after. And we can see that now we've got this graphic sitting between these two paragraphs. This is very helpful when you want to have sort of an interparagraph story marker, a little break marker or something like that. But what I really want is to place this graphic not in the middle of the story, but out here outside of the text frame itself, in the margins. So I'm going to change the Position pop-up menu to Custom. A custom anchored object can be anywhere on the spread you want to put it. In the Essential Training title, we saw that I could simply click OK here and drag this object to anywhere I want to put it. For example, I just drag this out into the margin, and maybe that's good enough. But if I really want to have precision where that's placed, if I really want to be explicit about where that's going to sit on my page, well, then I'm going to have to tackle that dialog box. I could go back to the Object menu to choose the Anchored Object options, but in this case, I'm going to right-click with a 2-button mouse, or if I only have a 1-button mouse on a Mac, then I will press Control-click, and from the context menu, I'll choose Anchored Object Options. You see, you've got all the same controls here. Click Options, move this dialog box out of the way, and this is a dizzying array of features here, of controls, but if you take it one at a time, it's really not so bad. The first thing you need to do in this dialog box is make sure the preview checkbox is turned on. If that's not on, you're going to get lost very quickly. Next thing you need to do is choose whether or not this object should be positioned relative to spine. That is, should the object be in a different position, whether it's on a right-hand page or a left-hand page. You then need to choose the Anchored Object Reference Point. And usually this is a single reference point proxy, just like the one up in the control panel. And this says what part of the object are we talking about? What part of that object is being positioned? For example, right now it's set to lower right corner, and that means the lower right corner of this object is the one that we're going to be positioning. If we set this to upper left corner, you can see that it suddenly moved. It suddenly moved. Why did it move? Because now it's positioning the upper left corner of the object. If relative to spine is turned on, then you're saying which part of the object on each page, and these little reference icons always mirror each other. So, for example, right now we're saying on a right-hand page, anchor the upper right corner of the object, but if it's on the left-hand page, then anchor the upper left corner of this object. But anchor it where? That's what the anchored positions area is for. The reference points controls will make no sense to you at all unless you've tackled the X or Y pop-up menus. So let's skip past that and look at X relative to. This lets you control where the horizontal position of that object should be based on. You have various controls in this pop-up menu, including the default, which is the text frame. So set in this case, the upper right corner of that object based on the edge of the text frame. But we can also say have it be based on the anchor marker. If it's based on the anchor marker, then as that anchor moves left or right, the object will move as well. If you wanted to position it precisely on a page instead of based on the text frame, you could choose one of the page options. But in this case, we're going to simply leave it based on the text frame. Where is it positioned based on the text frame? Well, that's what the X offset and the reference point is all about. I find that it's useful to read the Anchored Object Options dialog box out loud while I'm working, just in order to understand what's going on. So this says the upper right corner of this object is going to be based at -7 picas from the center of the text frame. See how that works? If we wanted to base it on the left edge of the text frame, we would click on the left point of the reference point area of the anchored position section. Is it getting confusing yet? A little bit, but you get the idea quickly here. Now we can see that the upper right corner is -7 picas from the left edge. If we change the X offset to 0 and then press Tab, we can see that the upper right corner is now 0 points away from the left edge of the text frame. That's how that's working. All right, let's increase this a little bit, maybe make it 9 points away from the edge of the text frame. Now we'll go on to the Y relative pop-up menu. That's the vertical positioning of this object. We have lots of controls here, including basing it on the line itself, in this case the baseline of the line, or the cap height, or the top of the line, or the top of the column edge, or the text frame. We can even, again, base it on the page if we want very precise positioning based on the overall geometry of the page instead of where it sits in the text. In this case, we're going to choose line cap height, because this is now based on the tallest capital letter in this line. So we can say the Y offset should be 0 points away from the top of this capital letter here. The Keep Within Top-Bottom Column Boundaries checkbox only appears when you choose one of the line options. If you choose column, text, or page, then this will be grayed out. But what this checkbox means is, as the text moves up or down, and therefore this anchored object moves up or down, do you want the anchored object to stay within the margins? If it's okay for it to go outside of the margins, then turn this off. But in this case, I want to make sure that object always stays within my text boundaries, my column boundaries, which is basically the margin. So I'm going to keep this checkbox turned on. I'm also going to turn on Prevent Manual Positioning, because when that's turned off, I might accidentally click on it and drag it, and that would completely throw everything I've done here in this dialog box out the window. So let's turn that on, and it locks it right in place. I'll click OK, and we can see that now that object is anchored in place. I'll scroll down a little bit, and I will remove some text here. I double-click to switch the type tool, selected some text, and I'll hit delete, and you can see that it anchors in place. It moves with the text, which is great. Let's go back to Fit, Spread, and Window mode. So Command-Option-0 on the Mac, or Control-Alt-0 on Windows. I'll delete a lot of text here, enough text to pull this object onto the left-hand page. And you can see that because relative to spine was turned on, the object flipped from going on the left side of that text frame to it's now on the right side of the text frame. I'm going to zoom in here one more time by clicking in that part of the text, press Command 2 or Control 2 on Windows, and I want to show you two more things having to do with anchored objects that are pretty important. First, I'll go back to the selection tool, and I'm going to come out of preview mode by pressing W, so we can see all our frame edges and the little anchored icon and so on. The first thing I want to point out is if I click on this object and go to the View menu, I can turn on Show Text Threads, and that shows me exactly where in the text this object is anchored. See that dashed line? That dashed line means it's anchored to this position way over here. Okay, that's the first thing I need to point out. Second thing is, what if I want to take it out of the text story? What if I don't want it to be an anchored object anymore, but I want to keep it in the same place? Well, I could cut and paste it, I suppose, using paste in place. That should work. But there's an even easier way, and that is to go to the Object menu, choose Anchored Object, and then choose Release. Release will actually take it right out of the story, but leave it in place, and that's what we were aiming for here. I'm going to undo that with Command-Z or Control-Z because I still want this anchored to show you the last issue having to do with anchored objects that we need to deal with. I'll right-click on this or Control-click with a one-button mouse on a Mac and choose Anchored Object Options. And I'm going to turn off Prevent Manual Positioning so that I can position it anywhere I want on my page. I'll drag it on to the left, and I want to show you something very interesting here by going to the Window menu and turning Text Wrap on. And I'll actually click on the text wrap, and we'll see something quite interesting here. It looks like text is wrapping around the object now, right? But let me move this over a little bit, and you can see that it actually is wrapping, but only on the lines after the anchored object. This is a very interesting and can be a very frustrating aspect of anchored objects. Anchored objects with text wrap only affect lines after the line they're anchored in. So this is actually anchored in this first line, so it has no effect on that line at all. If I move it up here, it also has no effect on this line up here. But it will affect any line after the line that it's anchored on. Let's go ahead and change this to make it force around the left edge of this object only. That's a little prettier. If I needed it to wrap this first line, well, I need to put it on a previous line. And one way to do that would be to select this object. I'll go ahead and just double-click here to place the cursor in the text frame. Then I'll go to the Edit menu, choose Edit in Story Editor, and you can see that this anchored object is represented by this icon. And I can select that icon in Story Editor and use drag and drop to drag this up to the previous line. I'll go ahead and close that. And then we can see that we can position this object again. It's positioned in the wrong place now. But we can position the object, and because it's anchored up here, it will affect all of these lines down here. Obviously, it takes a little time to get your head around anchored objects and how to use them, but once you do, you'll be rewarded. Anchored objects can be used in so many ways to save you time and effort.